No, I like to.
Are you sure?
I like the side.
Hello? Nope. Is it?
Do these things?
Are we?
They
can you
work.
hear me? Yeah, it's working now. Great.
This panel will be surveilled, by the way. So
Exactly. Just opening up my notes. Thank you, everyone, for coming to this panel. Sorry, I'm just bringing up my notes. This panel is on covering the surveillance state, and it's co-sponsored by my media company, Coda Story. We are covering authoritarian tech as of a couple months ago, rather relentlessly, hopefully being surveilled. And I'm really pleased to have two panelists who can speak on the issue. To my immediate right is Vian Bakir, who is a professor of journalism and physical geography, yes?
No, communication.
Of communications at the School of Music and Media at Bangor University in the UK. And then I have from OCCR, Drew Sullivan, who is editor-in-chief. I don't know your title.
Co-founder and editor-in-chief.
Co-founder and editor-in-chief. He's based in the Balkans, and if you're not familiar with OCCR, it does these metastasizing investigations into corruption and other authoritarian characteristics in Eastern Europe and beyond, and has been really on a roll the last few months. So maybe I'll begin, Vian, with you. Maybe you'd like to make some introductory remarks and talk about what your primary concerns are with surveillance. I know you've been particularly concerned with emotional monitoring tools. I should mention that she's written a book called Intelligence Elites and Public Accountability that came out last year?
Yes.
Yeah, that's very apropos as well. So let me turn it over to you and set the stage. Yeah.
So maybe just a few opening things, which you probably have heard before if you've been attending everything else at this panel in more depth everywhere else. So apologies if that is the case. But I just want to make a few points, really. Yeah. Can you hear me, by the way? Is that fine?
Yeah.
So first of all, we all know that a lot of data is already collected all the time, and there we go. And in democratic states, a lot of data is collected already. We already know that these are very diverse data sets. When they're combined through big data analytics, it builds a very rich picture of your life. Obviously, we know this: what you buy, where you go, your thoughts, what you're searching for on Google, what you're reading online, what you're buying, etc. Where you are. So, and we know that in democratic states, there have been intense arguments over the last few years about, whether such data collection and analysis and storage invades people's privacy or not, whether it's justified in the name of security, what the best forms of oversight are of the surveillance security services, what privacy legislation is needed to protect your data from being abused by the commercial sector, and, of course, the use of the data to target you with, for instance, political ads to influence you. This has all been discussed over the past few years and by this conference. Of course, when you move to authoritarian states, the state can just own and combine your data collected for its own ends. And the oversight and the laws, either they don't exist or they're not really used. So, if we think about the impacts of this and where this is going, research in the West, and it does tend to be in the West, has already observed the relatively well-known phenomenon of the chilling effect, the self-censoring critical expression amongst citizens and journalists. Most of the research on this seems to be in a US context and in the UK, but it does document it, the academic research, and it comes out of organisations like PEN as well. It does exist. The chilling effect does exist, even in democratic states where you have all this oversight and legislation to protect people. So, I mean, if we know this is happening, chilling effects, it is happening. The authoritarian situation is much worse. But I won't speak to that because I know that people at the front line will have great examples on that. I think one of my issues with all of this, though, is when the mass surveillance architecture, which is very heavily developed in the West, is then sold to authoritarian governments whose journalists and citizens have no privacy protections. I mean, obviously, this is a pretty bad situation. I mean, it has been documented for some time by outfits like Privacy International. Back in '95, Privacy International published Big Brother Incorporated. They've updated their report in 2016 with the global surveillance industry, provides a really comprehensive analysis of the surveillance industry. And here we have the commercial side, their history, their products, their customers. And they conclude that, obviously it's technically possible now in authoritarian countries to monitor entire groups, entire nations on a mass scale, systematically and relatively cheaply, which of course poses fundamental threats to civil society, individual security, human rights and democracy itself. So I'd say this is all bad enough. But what about new data streams that are coming online all the time? So, a new class of data which is coming on stream fairly rapidly is data about our emotions. And emotions are very core, right? They're very inner. We don't necessarily want the surveillance state to know what we're feeling. It's bad enough that they already know perhaps what we're thinking and reading and where we are and who we're associating with through state surveillance architectures. But what we're feeling, and when you think about the range of sensors that are out there now that can start to, gather physiological evidence and then interpret that for some authority as to what our emotions might be. So I'm thinking, monitors that we might actually choose to wear, heart rate monitors that monitor our heart rate. But then, you go into a shop and retail and you might have other monitors, cameras that can measure your pupil size, cameras that can measure the blood flow under your skin, sweat, breath rate. All of this stuff can say stuff about how you are feeling. And do you really want that level of intimate data to be picked up by surveillance states in authoritarian countries? I will just point to someone at the front of this room here. Andrew McStay has just written a book on emotional AI, emotional artificial intelligence, and the rise of empathic media. And I would just say he's got a great chapter in there about the rise of smart cities and in authoritarian states compared to non-authoritarian states. I don't want to bang on about this too much, but it's very worth reading that book, not least for the chapter on smart Dubai. Because if you think about smart cities, and these are coming everywhere, right, where you have sensors everywhere in public spaces, and they pick up on what the citizens and consumers are doing and feeling, the idea ostensibly is to make the city a better place, right? Better public services, more efficient, your bins are emptied on time, everything works better. And that's fine if you're in a democratic country, but what if you're in an authoritarian state? And what if the sensors being picked up aren't just picking up everything that we know they're picking up already, but then also data streams about your emotions? I just wonder about what the potential is for harms in that front. So definitely Google Smart Dubai and its happiness agenda. It's actually selling this as a way to make Dubai and its citizens a happier place. And I always get very suspicious of any authoritarian state that claims to be trying to make everyone happier. But maybe that's all I'll say on that for the moment.
It reminds me, there's a Maya Angelou quote that goes something along the lines of people forget what people say about you, and people will forget what people did to you, but you never forget how people made you feel. And the idea of surveillance intervening in our inner emotions is a remarkable thing. Drew, maybe I'll direct you toward an area in which you focus on as a journalist, which is a lot of it's corruption. and ask you, you know, as the surveillance state becomes triumphant, not just in authoritarian states, but quasi-authoritarian states and even democratic states, how does that change the way you look at crime? It becomes much more difficult to carry it out when you're being watched. And I'm wondering if that, as a journalist, has affected the way you focus your investigations.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, we're kind of in a brave new world now, and there's a lot of things happening. Just to give you a little anecdote, we train all our reporters in surveillance and counter-surveillance, physical counter-surveillance, because that's usually an indicator that you have a serious safety problem. You must surveil somebody before you kill them, for instance. So we train our reporters, and we had a training this weekend in Riga, and during the surveillance training, all our reporters were being surveilled by the Azerbaijani government, we think, you know, during the training. So that gives you some sense that, you know, of the state of surveillance nowadays. I spent some time at the Institute for the Future in Palo Alto, and I was interested in the future of crime. And I spent about 6 months talking to technologists and looking at where the future technologies are coming down the pipe. And I sadly concluded at the end of my 6 months that there really is no future to crime. Corruption is where you really want to get into. So, you know, crime is essentially a dead end, because as the surveillance state becomes increasingly empowered, it makes it very difficult to get away with anything. You know, you theoretically can track everybody's movements. To give you some idea, we have an organization gives us satellite photos for free, and they were bragging to us that within about 3 to 5 years, they would be able to provide us satellite video of every place on Earth 24 hours a day. Now you start to think about that. Your whole life can literally be tracked. And unfortunately, that information, we hope to get it pro bono, but the reality is that large corporations and countries and others will have that information far before the public does or journalists do. And they're launching literally 100 of these satellites at a time on Israeli rockets, and they cost about $25,000 a piece, and they can blanket the world with this kind of surveillance. So it really is a scary thing, and you know, the next level of printing, or the generation after, will be 4D printing, where they'll literally print circuitry within walls, and with every internet-ready object that you have in your house, and it'll be able to sense things like heat patterns, and of course, a heat pattern is almost like a fingerprint. And so even within buildings, they can tell exactly where you might move around and what you might be doing. So, you know, this technology, because we can do it, we certainly will do it, and it will be everywhere. And it'll essentially make it possible that your whole life will be monitored from beginning to end in a way that will be potentially open to abuse. So you know, this is the kind of things that we look. And if you look at even in the state of technology now, at a place like China and what they're doing in the Uyghur areas, Uyghurs are an ethnic group, a Muslim ethnic group that are in the far west, northwest of China. But all people are given identification cards. Those identification cards are linked to databases where they can bring up the whole history of your information with the Chinese government at any time. So at a checkpoint, which are omnipresent all over the Uyghur area, they're almost every couple blocks, that information can be checked. They do house-to-house inspections. They have convenience police departments, these little police you know, call boxes or centers that are on every corner where it's one per every 500 people in the area. So consequently, and they have, of course, phone and email monitoring, and they have mandatory DNA, you know, seizures, so that essentially it's all about control. And surveillance equals control. You know, massive surveillance basically at the end of it equals control, because it's sold to us as a safety issue. It's sold to us as we have to worry about terrorists and we have to worry about bad people. But then it starts to get used with the law-abiding citizens, and suddenly your exact same actions as a law-abiding citizen can at some point make you an outlier, can make you a terrorist, depending on the changing needs of the government. And so that's the real problem. And it essentially drives a standardization of opinion and action by the public. Otherwise, they'll be seen as an outlier, and we've seen, you know, in Nazi Germany and other places, outliers end up very poorly. You know, you've got a situation where when you do have this massive surveillance, you end up with massive control. And, you know, my favorite quote on this is from Ben Franklin, who said, those who give up essential liberty to obtain a little temporary security deserve neither liberty nor security. That's I think, a good plan to live by. So, you know, in the end, solutions for journalists, what can we do about this? I mean, the first thing is to explain to readers all the time how these systems work. They're often hidden, and you only find them out later. You know, it becomes something, you know, right now in China, they have, if you walk by these kiosks and you're wondering where your flight is, it has facial recognition software, and it will recognize you and bring up your flight data on the screen, which is pretty amazing. But that's something that you fortunately can see. What you don't see is where there's other types of tools that might be collecting this information, running you through databases and identifying you and seeing, you know, who you might be meeting with or other things like that. So to write about those things that we discover, you know, to uncover the surveillance state and to follow the money. The good thing about surveillance is it all comes from a particular company. There's somebody who makes the equipment, there's somebody who writes the software, there's somebody who installs all this. And as you can start understanding who these companies are, you can look at government spending, and that's what we often find. We noticed in Azerbaijan that they were buying, you know, FinFisher, which is a malware program that kind of resides at the very lowest level of your computer and essentially can bypass any encryption technology you might be using on your computer. And we found other states when there were leaked documents from some of these companies. I think the surveillance companies are companies we need to regularly report on and regularly follow to see where they're going and what they're doing. Let's surveil the surveillors. That's the only way we're going to find out, you know, how this works. And then when you find bad actors, to expose those individuals, you know, who are doing it. So, you know, old-fashioned journalism does work out. And the other thing is, I think we're obligated as journalists to speak out, because one of the things is this kind of spiral of silence, you know, that happens when people see people who speak out get, you know, beaten down. You know, the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. And in order to create that tolerance in society, we need to be continuously speaking up. And so when other journalists are attacked for these kind of things, it's up to all of us to jump in and say, I'm a nail too, start pounding me, and make it harder for them to do this. And then, you know, I think to a certain extent, we are going to, as journalists, have to limit our digital footprints and limit the amount of information that we give out. And actually what we do at OCCRP, and I shouldn't talk about this, but since you are all here for educational purposes, you know, at a certain point when you put your information on the internet, the hardest thing for information gatherers is misinformation. And so when you put information out there that's wrong, that may not be, I'm not talking about your news stories, don't do wrong news stories, but if there's information out about you, then that information doesn't necessarily have to be complete or correct. And so that creates a certain amount of dissonance in the system, the more bad information that's out there. And I think that's, you know, we're at the very beginning of this process. In 10 years from now and in 20 years from now, it's going to be really scary. And we already know that some of the worst actors, Saudi Arabia's, UAE and others, are investing very significantly into surveillance states. And this is something that you know, is concerning, and we just have to keep beating on this issue as journalists.
Yeah, it really wasn't that long ago when the most you and the best you could do to ward off surveillance was to take the battery out of your phone, right? And then you were fine. Now it's becoming much more complicated. That's really interesting about a little misinformation about yourself can go a long way. Are there, you know, the future is unknowable, but in the near present, is there anything in the journalist toolbox that we should be deploying now, or in the very near future, that perhaps we haven't thought of or we're not anticipating?
I don't think there's. I think we've thought of everything. Are we all doing it though? Actually, you know. I mean, so just I think it was just last week I published yet another guide. I don't know how many of these must exist now for journalists on how to protect your data and sources. So this was something I did with academic journalist in City University in London, Paul Lashmar, but also with the National Union of Journalists, which is Britain's biggest trade union for journalists. It's like 30,000 members, and Ireland as well. You know, and we said to them, look, do you need a guide? A few months ago, do you need a guide for your journalists on how to protect their data and sources? And they said, well, yeah, actually, we probably do, because there are loads of guides out there, but, you know, everything changes so fast in terms of the technology. And they said, we just don't think all of our journalists, all of our 30,000 members are taking adequate data security protections. And then when you look at the existing guides, a lot of them are very scary, I think. Like, they assume you're a really high-level investigative journalist that's holding, you know, massive power to account. But actually, a lot of journalists aren't. They're just, you know, they're local journalists, but they might still encounter surveillance in Britain even, which is a democracy with lots of oversight and privacy regulations. But they might well be being surveyed by the police, you know, because the police do have these sorts of surveillance powers. And in fact, the National Union of Journalists has lots of examples of this happening. So we were asked to actually write a guide that helps journalists quickly, first of all, assess their own level of risk of being surveyed by anybody, or hacked, that could be as well, and actually take adequate precautions, whether you're just a low-level local journalist. But you might be someone like Carol Cadwallader, you know, freelance journalist who exposed a lot of the Cambridge Analytica stuff in Britain. Freelance journalist. Did she know what she was doing when she started entering this fray and actually uncovering, you know, the likes of Cambridge Analytica and Aggregate IQ and big private financiers like Aaron Banks and the likes, you know, who are attempting to subvert British democracy through targeting and surveillance and all this sort of stuff? Did she understand that when she was going in? Freelancers, you know. So I think people who don't necessarily understand the terrain and what they're getting into are the ones that need the most protections, because I think this can come, you know, the surveillance can come from any angle and laws can be used to close down information. And this is in democracies, let alone in authoritarian states. So if you put this on a bigger picture, journalists worldwide, I don't know if the ones in authoritarian states are already so nervous and so clued up that they would just do this as a matter of course. Maybe they would, I don't know.
Yeah, it's you know, I mean, you know, our journalists are professionally paranoid. You're only paranoid when they're really not out to get you. You know? And so, you know, a permanent paranoid state is what we encourage all journalists. And in these, I think what it is there's a naivete in the West that journalists in authoritarian states don't have. And that's really the difference, because this is a matter of attitude. And I'll give you an example. An unfortunate example. We had a journalist named Jan Kuciak who was working with us, who was murdered in Slovakia, and he was not aware that we had done a safety check on him, and we had assessed that the types of documents he was mainly doing online searching of databases and other things, and he was not particularly at risk. What we didn't know is that he was under state surveillance, and in all likelihood there was probably a bug planted in his house, potentially even a camera planted in his house. And through that, they found the items that he was working on as he talked to his fiancée about them. And so that really became the problem. And we had another case of that. Hadija Ismailova, a reporter in Azerbaijan, had a camera placed in her house, which recorded her having sex with her boyfriend. And unfortunately, in Azerbaijan, that's a stoning offense because they were not married. And so consequently, they attempted to use that as compromise, as blackmail against her, which she refused to agree to, and just basically came out publicly and explained what had happened. And so, you know, but even in these cases, these were pretty, these were pretty savvy reporters. But what reporters don't really realize is how powerful they are, and they don't realize, that we are that 1 degree of separation from a lot of people, and large amounts of information flow through us. So we are a convenient source to tap and to figure out who's doing what and collecting information. So just for that very purpose, we are the ones that are surveilled first. We're kind of the canary in the coal mine, so to speak, in a surveillance state. What we've traditionally done is underestimated the ruthlessness of political parties and governments in each of these cases. And at OCCRP, we no longer underestimate that, and we have bug checks in our offices, and we have very sophisticated procedures in place, and any reporter who doesn't follow them are not allowed to work with us. And I'll literally fire somebody who can't protect themselves because they're a danger to themselves and to other reporters who they're working with. And this is unfortunately the kind of steps that we have to move to. So it really is a matter of pounding into the journalists that you are seriously at risk, and you are probably significantly underestimating the probability. And this isn't dramatics. This is the reality of the situation we're dealing with in a lot of surveillance states.
There was a movie in the mid-'90s, I think, starring Sandra Bullock called The Net. I don't know if anyone has seen it. Yeah,
it's so dated now.
It looks like it is from a different era. But what was interesting about that film, even at the time, was especially at the time, in order to create this character, and the movie is Sandra Bullock. I don't remember. She plays a character who is basically under complete digital surveillance, 1996 style. But in order to make that real in the movie, they had to create a character for Bullock that was completely out of a different, unrealistic. She had to basically be disconnected from the entire world, and now it's kind of the opposite. I wanted to ask about Vian, about Dubai as a sort of use case, the smart city movement, and where you see that headed in terms of surveillance and authoritarian technologies.
Well, I mean, Smart Dubai is an interesting one. I mean, so I was out there with Andy a couple of years ago, which was where we got the data for Andy's book on this. So you probably should ask him, actually, because he wrote the book. But I was there as he did some of the interviews, which were quite amusing, because he interviewed the architect of, I'm not going to say the name, don't worry. But he did interview a very high-up civil servant, who's the architect of the happiness agenda there. They have a happiness agenda to make Dubai one of the happiest cities on earth, and to measure it, actually. And I suppose part of this attracts investors, it attracts people, expatriates who might want to work out there. It's a nice thing to say your city's, your country is the happiest place on earth. I mean, normally it's the Scandinavian cities that actually win this on world monitoring rankings, Denmark and Scandinavia, things with good social networks and, systems to protect people in all forms of life. They actually win the happiness things, but Smart Dubai was vying for this to some degree. They definitely want to raise happiness levels and measure it in the city, and they also want it to be a smart city. So it's two things at once, right? Smart city and a happy city. So yeah, I mean, they're doing what smart cities do. They are making use of data streams across all walks of the city, from retail, but from public services as well, and from what people are buying, I suppose, and also what people are feeling, because I think you can rank how you feel about the place. You see this in airports a lot, don't you now? No, not just Smart Dubai, but did you have a nice time? You know, little emojis, happy, not, it's always sad for me, but airports. But, you know, so they have all of this sort of stuff, and I think they also, correct me if I'm wrong, Andy, but they also have been doing lab experiments on people with EEG and all that to actually see how people feel and respond to certain aspects of the city. So this is lots of data streams, right, which once you combine, if you combine those data streams, you get a very, well, perhaps nuanced picture of happiness levels or not in the city, which is fine if you're just talking about, is the public transport system working okay? And might be fine if you're just talking about, is the health service system working okay? Might not be fine if you have laws, remember authoritarian state, that allows the emirate to own all the data that companies and individuals produce in Dubai. And they do have a law, it's called, I can't remember what it's called, the Dubai Data Law or something like that from 2015. So, whereas in the West, these data streams would be siloed and protected, in an authoritarian state, no such protection. So, okay, so we don't know what they're actually doing with this data, but there is potential here for people to be re-identified, right? Very richly. Would they do that? I don't know. Would they want to do that? Why might they want to do that? You could start to think about the possible harms that would emerge from this. So the other thing I think Dubai is interesting, though, is they sell their model of the smart city to other countries around the world. So there's Dubai Holdings Company, which has already sold contracts, I think, or has contracts for smart cities in other parts of the world, which may also be very weak democracies or very corrupt democracies or non-functioning places, you know. And I just sort of feel nervous, I suppose, I think. If Dubai and Smart Dubai is developing a very sophisticated surveillance architecture built on a happiness agenda, which is a way of lulling people in as well, I think. You know, so you lull people in not just by increasing their security, and that's the sell, but by increasing their happiness. Oh, it's a much nicer place to be. And then you use that and you sell that model abroad. I don't know, Nigeria, Lagos, other places. Malta, I think, is another one. I don't know how that would fare on the acceptability spectrum. So I just think it's a bit worrying. I think journalists should be keeping a very close eye on this. And I think when you're also starting to track not just the standard surveillance in public spaces, but also people's inner feelings, and I do think this is on stream, and it's not just pie in the sky. There are companies out there that pertain to measure our emotions. Now, whether or not they're doing it accurately is one thing, because, you know, emotions, very, very fuzzy concept. I think, and Andy will confirm me if I'm wrong or right here, but I believe the underlying models about how you actually ascertain what an emotion actually is, and then how you actually map that onto what you can measure, you know, be it heart rate or breath rate or pupil dilation or your facial expression. It's not a pure science in any way, right? It's very easy to get it wrong, misinterpret, but companies are still out there, and they are surveillance companies, but they're surveying your emotions, and they're selling this back to governments, municipalities, security companies, saying, like, we can actually detect people's emotions, and that could be very useful. I mean, you know, to detect the mood of a crowd, for instance. Is it going to turn violent? Is it going to turn angry? You know, Beyond Verbal in Israel do this on voice analytics. Affectiva do this on facial analytics. I think Microsoft do it. So the big companies are coming in as well. It's not just little, what we startups, but big tech companies are doing this too. And I just think, you know, once all these different actors are interested in a certain type of new data, and I don't know if we have the laws in place. Do we have laws to regulate how companies, how states might capture data about emotion? Is that a privacy thing?
GDPR.
Is it a privacy thing though? Is
don't
it?
know.
I mean, it's intimate data, but if it's in a public space, you've written on this, Andy, if it's in a public space, does it need to be private? You know, so, I don't know, I think there are lots of issues here that we probably should be thinking about.
And if you look at some of the ways that the stuff is used, it gives some indication on the bad effects of it. And you know, if you look at how, you know, aggregating data is the really important technology here. And we as journalists do it. You know, we have a knowledge management system that we take large numbers of public records and we put them together and we identify and disambiguate identities and individuals and companies, and we match them all together to give us a map of money and power. You know, so we're doing very much the same thing that these organizations are doing. But as you aggregate a lot of this more sensitive information, you can answer a lot more questions. And companies like Cambridge Analytica brag that they can take your Facebook postings, and by what albums you like and what stores you shop at, they can tell you whether you're gay or not, or whether you're a Republican, or all sorts of other things using, you know, regression analysis, you know. And you can get some kind of predictability out of, you know, people's patterns and predict some of these things. Maybe not as good as Cambridge Analytica thinks you can. That's in their marketing literature. But it is really dangerous. And the thing that's going to really ramp this up to a whole other level is really artificial intelligence and how that's used. And, you know, that's going to be more disrupting than the internet was, I think, to businesses and to journalism in particular. We are an information, you know, data information business, and artificial intelligence is going to completely change that. And, you know, the fourth generation bots that are being, you know, not quite designed yet, but as they implement artificial intelligence, can take all this information you've made about yourself publicly, or all this information in these databases of your happiness and other things, and create basically models to figure out how to manipulate you. And so, you know, the bot that you will be talking to, not knowing it's not a human being, will be convincing you to vote for, you know, Donald Trump Jr. in 2028, and be using this technology to make a very cogent and logical, you know, argument to you that will make you happy that you should vote for Donald Trump, you know, Jr. in 2028. You know, so that's, you know, it's clear that information is being used to manipulate people. It's clear information is being used to background individuals. And, you know, Jamal Khashoggi was likely killed because of, you know, information that was stolen from him and used to find out what he was working on and to make a conclusion on whether he should live or die. So this is really a life and death issue now, unfortunately, and we're giving it about 0.05% of the emphasis that it really deserves. And this is a huge area, and like all new areas of technology, it will disrupt us before we know what's going on. And it will change the world before we know what's going on, and we'll be playing catch up for years and years afterwards. It's just how we are as humans. So
yeah, I'm struck. You know, I think we're all vigilant to companies and governments marketing new technologies, surveillance technologies, authoritarian technologies for the benefits, when of course there's always the flip side. But we're less vigilant to. It's almost a bait and switch. You know, we're looking at the wrong dangers, right? So driverless cars. The media's been focused on a certain amount of casualties, right? Some pedestrian deaths have resulted from driverless cars. What does that mean? Can we ever have driverless cars? But it's, you know, it seems to me the real danger aren't pedestrians dying. The real danger is that governments are going to be able to control whether or not you can leave your city.
And at the same time, it also empowers individuals in ways that can sometimes be scary. I mean, theoretically, you know, in the Internet of Things, you can hire a drone in another country, you know, to fly into somebody's car when they're driving, or you could become a remote assassin, you know, killing somebody remotely through these kind of technologies. So it empowers an individual to affect a large number of people as well, which can be destructive or constructive depending on how it's used. So
I want to open this up to questions. Is there anyone? Yes, you had your hand up first, the woman in green.
Hi, yeah, thanks for raising the very interesting issue in the panel. My name is Anna Sarast, and I also report a bit more on like surveillance laws in Europe. I would have two questions for the speakers. The first one would have to do with another old movie that is now kind of becoming reality, which is Minority Report, of course. So the issue of crime prevention. Because although you said that crime is less of an issue of the future than corruption, it feels like there is a lot of things that are being tried out in the US and Great Britain and so on to prevent crime. So if you could maybe talk a bit about that, what are maybe your fears, or where you also see kind of the ethical maybe stumbling points when it comes to crime prevention with surveillance. And the second would have to do with kind of this surveillance law ecosystem, because since especially kind of the Paris attack of 2015, a lot of EU countries also changed their legislation when it comes to surveillance. Germany changed their laws. France, Great Britain anyway is kind of an interesting case. My country, Finland, also just got its first surveillance law. So what is your predictions also when it comes to these kind of long-standing democracies, and what will we see there next when it comes to legislation? Thank you.
I don't know a lot about law. I know in Britain, after the Snowden leaks, and there was a debate in Britain, and do we need more surveillance, less surveillance? How should it be overseen, regulated? You know, there was a debate in the media. It very much privileged the government side, actually, and the intelligence services side, that we just need more surveillance for security. And actually, we have enough oversight, and the oversight is good in Britain, so we don't really need to do anything very much. And in fact, they did change the oversight regime a bit with a Surveillance Act in 2015, like 2 years after Snowden's leaks. But it actually made the surveillance even more intensive. But they justified it by saying, well, you know, we're going to slightly change the oversight regime by making an independent judge one of the overseers, because we know that people trust judges. So, you know, and then they made the data that can be surveyed open, available to many more agencies within the government, like, you know, the tax inspectors and the police and all that. So the surveillance regime got much worse in Britain. And this was following Snowden's leaks, where, you know, there was a massive debate, certainly in America, but the balance between civil liberties, privacy, and security. So, I mean, I'm quite pessimistic, I think, really, about the future laws that might be developed on surveillance, because I think governments, as you said, I think governments do sell it to citizens on the security issue, and there's very little proof, from what I can see, that the security is improved by masses of surveillance. But it seems to just have its own logic, almost. You know, a security surveillance logic prevails. Now, it might play out differently in different countries, and maybe in Scandinavia, maybe you're a bit more savvy, a bit less scared. But I don't know, in any country, I think, where you can make the citizens scared, and there are legitimate reasons to be scared, you know, Christchurch, New Zealand. But I was so pleased to see their Prime Minister come out and say, we will not change fundamentally in New Zealand what will happen because of this horrible terrorist attack. You know, it doesn't represent who we are. We're not going to ramp up the security state in response. And I thought that was a really bold move, actually. But it's rare. I mean, I've not seen that move in other countries, and they tend to use terrorism as a reason to, you know, do more surveillance, and because the government likes more surveillance. They just inherently likes it, it seems. They like to control, or have the ability to control, the state. Now, whether or not they use it, and whether or not they use it wisely, and whether or not there's enough oversight, these are all good debatable questions, but fundamentally I think governments do like to ramp down on the surveillance and on the control, but I don't know beyond that, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think you know, in the terms of government, especially law enforcement, use of surveillance to stomp down on crime, it has worked to some extent. I mean, I don't think we can completely say that it's you know, it's just that they always get more surveillance than they actually need for what they're doing. And the reality is that, you know, if you look at a lot of the big crimes in the United States, high-profile things, they usually catch people fairly quickly. And in a lot of other countries, it's not always the case. But, you know, that's probably, there's at least systems in place for making sure that, you know, a judge approves these kind of activities, although those are eroding very quickly. And so what happens is they may be set up for a legitimate benefit, but it erodes. And laws move much, much slower than technology, and they're always out of date, and they move much slower than people. And so the laws really never catch up to the technology. The new wave of technology is always much, much quicker. And so consequently, I think there will always be imbalances, and unless you really, really trust your government and you have really good systems in place, which can be designed, for the most part, governments will abuse this. As you know, 98% of the governments will end up abusing this, just because you can, you know, and it's political. Increasingly, things are political, even in democratic countries now, where the politics overrides you know, the traditional considerations of justice and, you know, law.
You may already know of the Berkman Center at Harvard. It's an excellent website to go to about law, and so you already know about it, yeah. Okay, we have one more in the back, two more. We have to end this at 5:02, so maybe we can take both questions and then answer them.
You talk about there's likely to be an imbalance, but I just wonder whether there's any way of ever kind of like bridging this gap between the power of governments and the kind of the surveillance technology that is now being sold and the citizen. I mean, you talk about, Andy, the security that you've got in your office, but because the reality is most people are not, you know, they might have got to the stage of having a sort of two-factor authentication on their email or something. But for most people, there's a sense that you're never going to catch up. Everyone is still going to be, the governments and those who control the technology are always going to be ahead. Isn't this almost like a bit utopian, the idea that it's possible to do so? And therefore, is there maybe an argument that you're kind of totally transparent and open, you just accept that everything is going to be surveilled? Or the older alternative is we all just tune out and log off.
In the second, yeah.
Yeah, hi. I'll start my question with a plug, which is we're going to have a panel at the World Conference of Science Journalism in July in Lausanne on journalism in a populist era. And I imagine some of these topics will arise, so I hope some folks can make it. I wanted to ask, how do we approach threat assessment across these incredibly varied situations? I mean, I'm in the United States and I proselytize digital security to colleagues, and we've had, we had a really terrible newsroom shooting last year, but on the other hand, it's certainly not a situation akin to some of the situations you've been talking about. So finding that balance between security and getting overly alarmist is a challenge. I wondered how you suggest approaching that.
Well, the nice thing about threat assessments is there's still a limited number. It's always about people or an organization, and so it is a manageable problem. So you can figure out we do reporting. We figure out who kills, why they kill, when they kill, how they kill, those types of things. We figure out who we're reporting on that's going to do, eavesdropping and other things, and we can use reporting skills to figure that out. So the problem is there's so many more threats, and as we're globalized, the threats are globalized, and you end up, spending a lot of resources in your news organization doing these assessments, and then of course you can figure out 95% of the people who mean you harm, but there's always that 5% wild card nutcases that you can't do anything about. And to a certain extent, we're soft targets as journalists. And so, you know, we're always going to be basically at risk. And you got to go into this business knowing, you know, your life may not end well. But by the same token, I mean, I think, you know, you can't worry about the bad side of it. You just got to keep plugging away. And, you know, people think I'm cynical. I'm really not cynical. I think I'm experienced, you know, and the experience shows that, you know, the gap will never be bridged. And I think we're in a situation where we will always be behind the curve, and there will always be abuses until the abuses get so bad that, you know, something happens, governments are thrown out, revolutions happen, and things then change. And we're with technology speeding things up, it's going to happen much more quicker. You know, the next 5 years, next 50 years are going to be absolute incredible chaos, and there's nothing we can do about it except tell people how the world works.
I think are we at the end? I will leave on a optimistic note because I've been incredibly frustrated with these webcams, and the heat sensors that Drew is talking about sounds very promising for my quest in finding out what the hell my dog has been doing in the afternoon. So there's a plus side to all of this. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to my panelists. Thank you for coming, and have a great rest of the conference.